The steam from the locomotive curled into the gray Scottish sky like breath on cold glass. Rose Elliott stepped onto the platform at Invercraig Station with a single leather bag, her eyes searching the small crowd gathered beneath the stone arch of the station house. She found him easily, the only man holding a photograph, comparing it to her face with the careful attention of someone inspecting a purchase. Their eyes met. He looked at the photograph again, then at her, the auburn of her hair, the windburn on her cheeks from 3 days of travel, the way her coat pulled across her shoulders after weeks of sitting in train carriages across England and up through the Highlands. Something shifted in his expression. Without a word, without the courtesy of even a shake of his head, he tore the photograph cleanly in two, dropped the pieces onto the wet platform stones, and walked away. The crowd fell silent. The locomotive hissed and began to pull away toward the mountains, and Rose Elliott understood with a cold and final certainty that she had nowhere left to go. The torn halves of her photograph lay face up on the rain-damped stone, her own eyes looking back at her from the platform. She had imagined this moment so many times during the long journey north from London. The awkward greeting, the careful conversation, the slow building of something she might one day be allowed to call a life. She had steeled herself for disappointment. She had not imagined this. "Well," said a voice to her left, laced with Edinburgh vowels and thinly veiled satisfaction. "That's quite something, isn't it?" A woman in a gray tweed coat stood near the station wall, fanning herself with a folded newspaper despite the cool Highland air. Her eyes were bright with the particular hunger of someone who feeds on the misfortunes of strangers. "Malcolm Reed has always been a precise sort of man. One can't fault him for knowing what he wants. These arrangements, bringing women up from England, are always a gamble. Sometimes the letter doesn't match the reality." Rose felt the heat crawl up her neck. She wanted to speak, to say that the photograph had been taken only 3 months ago, that she was exactly who she had claimed to be in every letter she had written. But her voice had locked itself somewhere behind her ribs. "Agnes, that's enough." An older man in a grocer's apron stepped forward and gave the woman a firm look before turning to Rose with something that resembled genuine decency. "Miss, is there someone we can wire, family in England who could send funds for the return journey?" Rose shook her head. There was no one. Her parents had died within a year of each other, her father first from the cold that settled in his lungs, her mother from grief that looked like illness but wasn't. Her uncle in London had taken her in with barely concealed reluctance, and she had spent 2 years being useful and invisible in equal measure. The advertisement seeking a wife for a Highland farmer had seemed like an answered prayer, a chance to be chosen, to build something, to matter to someone in a house where she was not a burden. "I have a little money," she managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Is there a boarding house nearby?" "Full," Agnes cut in with the satisfaction of someone delivering bad news they have been saving. "And besides, a young woman, alone in these circumstances. Catherine McCallan runs a respectable establishment. She won't take on someone with this sort of situation attached to her name. The whole glen will know by supper time." She was right, and they all knew it. The crowd on the platform had thinned, people drifting back to their afternoon, their errands, their ordinary Scottish Friday, but the story would travel ahead of them like smoke. Rose bent slowly and picked up the 2 halves of her photograph. She smoothed them together against her coat. She looked hopeful in the picture. She looked very young. "Miss," the grocer, Hamish she would come to know, tried once more. "The southbound train comes through at 6. I could perhaps—" Movement at the far end of the platform stopped him. 2 figures were approaching, a man and a small girl. The man walked with the long, unhurried stride of someone entirely accustomed to covering ground, across moorland, up hillsides, through weather. The child beside him skipped in the unself-conscious way of a child who has not yet learned to be still, her small hand clasped in his. They reached the platform just as Agnes turned away with a decisive swish of grey tweed. The man paused, taking in the scene with calm, unhurried attention. Rose with her leather bag and her torn photograph, Hamish with his uncomfortable posture, the particular quality of silence that follows a witnessed humiliation. "Afternoon, Hamish." His voice was deep, roughened at the edges, carrying the cadence of the Highlands. "Train on time?" "It was, Daniel. Left a situation behind, though." "Aye, I can see that." His gaze moved to Rose, and she found herself met with eyes that were the precise colour of a Highland loch in autumn, dark grey-green and very direct. "Miss," he said simply. The little girl stepped out from behind his leg and studied Rose with the frank, unguarded curiosity of childhood. She had her father's colouring, dark hair, serious eyes, but her face was open where his was guarded. "Is that lady sad, Papa?" she whispered, not quietly enough. Grace, a gentle word, not a reprimand. Rose blinked. She had not realized her eyes had filled. She turned away under the pretense of adjusting her bag and pressed her lips together until the feeling passed. "Hamish," Daniel's voice dropped. "Tell me." Hamish told it in low, careful sentences. The arrangement, Malcolm Reed's rejection, no funds, no prospects, no one to wire. Daniel listened with his eyes on the mountains beyond the platform. When Hamish finished, a stillness settled over him, the kind that Rose would come to understand meant something was being decided, quietly and irrevocably. Malcolm Reed left her stranded. Not a question. "He has his reasons." "I didn't ask about his reasons." He turned and looked at Rose fully. Not the evaluating look Malcolm Reed had given her, something else entirely, steady and direct, and she thought, angry on her behalf. "Can you cook?" he said. "Keep a house? Tend a kitchen garden?" The practicality of it cut through her shock like cold water. "Yes, I kept house for my uncle's family in London, 7 of them. My daughter and I have a farm about 6 miles from here, sheep mostly, a vegetable garden that's been losing the battle since spring. My wife died 2 years ago, and I've been managing poorly ever since." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "I could use help. You could use a roof over your head. A temporary arrangement, honest work in exchange for room and board, while you find your footing." Hamish made a protest. "Daniel, people will talk. A young woman, unmarried, out at Cairnholm. They'll talk regardless. At least this way she has somewhere warm to sleep while they're doing it." His jaw was set. "Well, miss." "Elliot," she said. "Rose Elliot." "Miss Elliot, it's your choice." Grace peered up at her with enormous eyes. "We have a cat," she offered, as if this settled the matter. Despite everything, the shame of the platform, the cold of the Highland afternoon, the wreckage of everything she had traveled so far to reach, Rose felt something ease inside her chest. She looked at the man who had asked for nothing except her honest labor, and at the child who had offered a cat as proof of welcome. "I'll come," she said, "and I'll earn my keep, I promise you that." Daniel nodded once, as though a contract had been signed. "Cart's just down the road. I'll have you settled before dark." The road to Cairnholm wound through landscape that made Rose catch her breath despite herself. Moorland rolling away to purple hills, lochs appearing without warning between folds of land, the sky enormous and dramatic overhead, clouds moving fast across the last of the evening light. It was nothing like London. It was nothing like anywhere she had ever been. Grace sat in the back of the cart and talked without pause, telling Rose about the sheep and the cat, whose name was Thistle and who had, Grace reported gravely, very strong opinions, and her father's attempts at making porridge, which she described as gray and sad. "It's not that bad," Daniel said. "It is, Papa. Even Thistle won't eat it." Rose kept her eyes on the hills and let herself smile, just slightly, into the wind. The farmhouse appeared as the last light faded, solid and low-built in the Highland manner, gray stone and slate roof, a wide vegetable garden gone to riot beside it, a barn beyond with warm light leaking from the cracks. It was weathered, and it was worn, and it was clearly a place where one man had been trying to do the work of three, but it was also, undeniably, a place someone had once loved. Her room was small, under the eaves, with a window that looked out toward the loch. It contained a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and more quiet than Rose had known in years. It was more than enough. That evening she made soup from what she found, a ham bone, leeks, dried barley, a bunch of parsley hanging from a hook near the window, and baked a simple loaf while Grace sat at the kitchen table drawing horses with a stub of charcoal. When Daniel came in from the barn and sat down and tasted the soup, he went very still. "This is real food," he said, as though the concept had become theoretical. "It's just broth. I haven't had just broth in 2 years." He ate the entire bowl and a good portion of the bread, and Grace ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had been surviving on gray and sad.
Porridge, and Rose sat across from them in the lamplight and felt for the first time in a very long while that she was somewhere she might be able to breathe. The days made their own shape. Rose woke early and had the range going before Daniel came in from morning chores. Grace proved to be a devoted helper in the garden, determined and tireless, hauling water from the well, pulling weeds with fierce concentration, asking questions about every plant Rose touched. The garden responded with the gratitude of something long neglected and finally seen. Indoors, the house slowly came to life around her attention. Curtains appeared at windows that had been bare. Floors were scrubbed. The smell of bread and wood smoke replaced the gray emptiness that had been there before. Grace began lessons at the kitchen table each afternoon, reading, simple arithmetic, the names of the hills that surrounded them. She was clever and quick and hungry for knowledge in the way of a child who has been left mostly to her own devices. Some mornings, when the light was good and Grace was in a quiet mood, she would say, "Mama used to sit here," and then carry on as though she hadn't said it, and Rose would feel the weight of those 4 words settle gently into the room. "Clara, she was 4 when Clara died," he told her one evening, when Grace was in bed and the kitchen was quiet. He was sitting with a cup of tea, his large hands wrapped around it, looking at nothing in particular. She doesn't remember much, just feelings, the sound of her mother's voice, the way the house felt different afterward. "The way houses always feel different," Rose said softly, "when the person who made them warm is gone." He looked at her then. "You've lost people too. Both my parents, within a year of each other." He didn't offer platitudes, he simply nodded, the nod of a man who understood that some things don't require commentary. "Why did you help me?" Rose asked, the question she had been carrying since the platform. "You didn't know me. I could have been anyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Clara came north from Edinburgh as a young woman. No family, very little money, a great deal of stubborn hope." He turned his cup in his hands. "If no one had been decent to her when she needed it—" He stopped. "When I saw you on that platform, I saw her. I saw what could have gone wrong for her. I couldn't walk past it." Rose felt something shift in her chest, not pity, but understanding. He was not rescuing a stranger, he was honoring a memory.
"She sounds like she was remarkable," Rose said. "She was." A pause. "So are you, in different ways." Fever came for Grace at the height of an unseasonable September warmth, sudden and climbing fast. By late afternoon, the child was burning, her small face flushed, and her breath too quick. Rose sent Daniel to fetch cold water from the burn and worked steadily through the hours, cool cloths and careful coaxing of sips of water between cracked lips. Daniel came and went from the well with mechanical determination, his face set into lines of fear he was holding by sheer force of will. Around midnight, Grace's temperature spiked, and she began to shake with chills that made no sense in the close warmth of the room. Daniel paced to the window. "This is how it began with Clara," he said, very quietly. "A fever. She said it was nothing." Rose stood and took his hand without thinking, gripping it firmly. "This is not the same. Grace is young and she is strong. She needs you to believe that, so believe it." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes. Then he went and knelt beside his daughter's bed. "Listen to me, little one," he said, his voice rough and tender at once. "You're a McKinnon, and McKinnons don't give in. Do you hear me? Keep fighting." Grace's eyes flickered open. "Papa?" she breathed. "Right here. I'm not going anywhere." The fever broke just before dawn, quiet as a tide going out. Grace's skin cooled beneath Rose's hand, and the terrible tension left the room like a held breath finally released. Daniel sat back on his heels and closed his eyes, and the relief on his face was the most unguarded thing Rose had ever seen from him. When he opened them again, he looked at her, and the gratitude in them went deeper than words could easily reach. "I couldn't have done this without you." I froze. I saw her lying there, and all I could think of was, "You didn't freeze. You were there all night. You didn't stop." "Neither did you." He reached across and took her hand the way she had taken his in the dark hour and held it. "Rose, I need to say something." She waited. "These past weeks, having you here, it has changed everything. For Grace, yes, but not only for Grace." His voice was careful, choosing each word with the precision of someone not accustomed to speaking their heart. "I know you came here because you had nowhere else to. I know this was only meant to be temporary, but somewhere along the way it stopped feeling temporary to me." The room was very quiet. Through the window, the first gray light of a highland dawn was beginning to soften the darkness. "I'm not a man who speaks easily about feeling," he continued. "I will disappoint you sometimes. This life is hard and isolated, and the weather is frequently appalling." The ghost of something that might become a smile crossed his face. "But I would show up for you every day. I would work beside you and stand by you and be honest with you always, if you would stay. Not as hired help, as my wife, as Grace's mother, as someone who belongs here, because I believe you do." Rose looked at this man, who had stepped forward on a platform when no one else had, who had knelt beside his daughter through a long dark night, who was now offering her the most honest and unadorned kind of love she had ever been offered, and felt with absolute certainty that she was being asked exactly the right question at exactly the right time. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay. I'll marry you." Grace from the bed opened one eye. "I knew it," she murmured, and went back to sleep. They were married on a clear October morning, the hills around Cairnholm dressed in amber and bronze, the loch below the farm holding the sky in its still surface like a mirror. Hamish and his wife came as witnesses. The minister from the village performed the ceremony on the farmhouse steps, plain and honest and perfectly suited to two people who had both learned the hard way what truly mattered. Rose wore a dress of soft ivory wool, fabric she had found folded with careful hope in a trunk at the bottom of the wardrobe.
She had asked Daniel before cutting it. He had been silent for a moment, and then said she would want it used for something good. The vows were simple. No poetry, no grand declarations, only the steady, serious promise of two people who had already seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. That evening, Grace fell asleep at the kitchen table mid-sentence, exhausted by the joy of the day, and Daniel carried her to bed with the effortless tenderness of a father who had been doing this since she was small. When he came back downstairs, Rose was standing at the window, watching the October moon rise over the loch. He came to stand behind her, his hands warm at her shoulders, and together they looked out at the land that was now truly, legally, permanently theirs.
"Are you frightened?" he asked. "Not of this," she said. "Not of you." She turned to face him. "I came north expecting one life. I found it in pieces on a platform. And then I found something real instead. Something I didn't know to hope for." He cupped her face in both hands, careful, certain, and kissed her, and the moonlight lay across the highland hills like a blessing on everything they were about to build together. By the following spring, the garden was magnificent. Rows of vegetables Rose had coaxed from neglected soil now grew straight and abundant. Grace could read anything she was handed. Thistle, the cat, had conceded, finally, to sleep on Rose's lap as well as Grace's. The farmhouse had curtains and warmth and the smell of bread, and in the mornings, before anyone else stirred, Rose would stand at the kitchen window with her tea and look out at the loch and the hills and feel, all the way to her bones, that she was somewhere she belonged. One April morning, Daniel found her there. He stood beside her and they watched the light change on the water together, in comfortable, unhurried silence. Two people who had no need to fill the space between them with noise. "I used to think," Rose said quietly, "that being left on that platform was the end of something." "And now?" She leaned into his side and he put his arm around her without looking away from the loch. "Now I think it was the door," she said. "I just couldn't see what it was opening onto." Somewhere upstairs, Grace began to sing, clear and unself-conscious and entirely off-key, the sound of a child who feels safe enough to be heard. And the Highland morning came in through the windows, gold and clean, and Rose Elliott Mackinnon closed her eyes and let herself, completely and at last, be home.